Welcome to Somali Nexus, where the past meets the present and Somali history comes alive, one story at a time. Today, we're stepping into the salt-kissed winds and stone-built ports of the northeastern Somali coast, a region that for centuries stood as a bridge between Africa, Arabia, and the wider Indian Ocean world. This episode is dedicated to a powerful, often overlooked chapter in our history, the Majeerteen Sultanate, a Somali maritime kingdom that rose in the 18th century and stood its ground through waves of diplomacy, trade, and colonial pressure until its final dissolution in 1927. But this wasn't just another coastal power. The Majeerteen Sultanate was a homegrown state, rooted in clan alliances, Islamic tradition, and oceanic vision. Its rulers governed a vast stretch of coastline with savvy political maneuvering and an eye on both the desert horizon and the distant sea. At a time when global empires were racing to carve up the Horn of Africa, the Majeerteen leaders signed treaties on their own terms. They managed bustling port cities like Bosaso, Kandala, and Alula, collected revenue from foreign ships, built forts that still stand today, and even played colonial powers against one another to preserve their sovereignty. And here's something even more fascinating. They turned shipwrecks into diplomacy. When European steamships ran aground on Somali shores, it wasn't chaos that followed. It was negotiation. Treaties were signed, alliances struck, and reputations built. But this story isn't just about grandeur. It's also about resistance. It's about secret arms deals with Somali freedom fighters, betrayals from former allies, and the slow, painful encroachment of colonial power. So, wherever you're listening, whether you're walking, working, or just taking a moment to connect, get ready. Because this is the story of how Somali leadership, strategy, and resilience shaped the Indian Ocean world. This is Somali Nexus. Let's dive in.
Okay, so you sent over this really interesting material on the Majeerteen Sultanate.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty significant pre-colonial state in Somalia.
Right.
So I'm thinking this could be like a crash course almost in understanding how it really shaped the Horn of Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to get bogged down in every single detail, just the big picture stuff.
Definitely. The key insights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to kind of set the stage, we're talking about a sultanate that pops up in the 18th century.
That's right.
And thrives for like over 2 centuries.
2 centuries? Yeah.
In northeastern Somalia.
Yeah. Really impressive longevity.
Yeah. And from what I'm seeing in these sources, they had a powerful navy.
Oh, yeah. A formidable force.
A really organized administration. And they even resisted colonialism for quite a while.
They did. For a significant period, they really held their own.
Okay, so we've got a lot to cover.
We do.
They're going to look at its origins, how they ran things.
The governance structure, their economy, the economic engine.
How they dealt with other powers.
Diplomacy and foreign relations.
And eventually what led to their decline.
The factors that contributed to their downfall.
Perfect. So these sources you've given me,
yeah,
they really do paint a pretty comprehensive picture.
They do. They offer a really solid overview.
And we're going to break down the most fascinating parts.
Yeah, absolutely. The most compelling aspects for everyone listening.
So think of this as our deep dive into the rise and impact of this really important Somali kingdom without getting lost in the weeds.
Exactly. A clear and concise understanding.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with the story of the Majeerteen Sultanate?
Well, the story really starts with the Majeerteen clan,
okay,
which is a major part of the Darude Confederation.
And remind me what the Darude Confederation is?
It's a large alliance of Somali clans, all kind of related to each other.
So like a huge network of clans.
Exactly. A powerful force in the region.
Got it.
And within that, you have the Majeerteen clan.
Okay.
And they're really central to the emergence of the Sultanate.
And you sent over some info on this Bokor Osman Mohamud.
Yes, Bokor Osman. He's the key figure here.
So he's like the founder.
You could say that. He really consolidated power in the mid-18th century.
And united all these different subclans.
Right. He brought them together under his leadership.
Interesting. So before we get into Bokor Osman's role, what was Somali society like before the Sultanate came about?
Right. So before the Sultanate, you're looking at a society that was largely nomadic, primarily pastoralist.
People moving around with their livestock.
Exactly. herds of camels, cattle, sheep, goats.
They were following grazing lands and water sources.
That's it. That was their way of life.
And what about leadership?
So leadership back then was mainly clan-based.
So clan elders making the decisions?
Yeah, pretty much. They held a lot of authority.
And I'm guessing there was already some trade going on.
Oh, yeah. Even in this nomadic society with coastal settlements, neighboring community.
So they weren't totally isolated.
No, not at all. They were connected through these trade networks.
So what prompted this shift then from a more decentralized clan-based system?
Yeah, good question.
To a formal sultanate?
Well, from what I gather from the sources, there was a growing need for stronger, more centralized governance.
Like they needed more unity.
Right, exactly.
To deal with challenges.
Yeah, maybe conflicts over resources.
Maybe they wanted to expand their influence.
Possibly also economic ambitions.
Like controlling trade routes.
That's a good point. Maybe tapping into those opportunities more effectively.
Yeah, so it sounds like a combination of factors.
Yeah, a complex interplay of social, economic, and political dynamics.
Right, and this is where Bokor Osman comes in.
Exactly.
He sees this need for change.
Yeah. He recognizes these challenges and opportunities.
And what does he do?
So he steps up and starts centralizing authority.
Okay.
Starts uniting these subclans under his leadership.
And so he's bringing them together.
Yeah, creating a more cohesive political entity.
In the sources mention a centralized administration.
Right. He establishes a more structured system.
Okay.
With governors, military leaders, advisors.
So a clear hierarchy.
Yeah, a more organized way of running things.
Makes sense. And there's this emphasis on him building a navy.
Oh, the navy. That was a game changer.
Okay, why so important?
Well, think about their location.
Northeastern Somalia, right on the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. A prime spot for trade. And this navy wasn't just for show. It was a real force protecting those trade routes.
That makes sense. Got to keep those goods flowing.
And also deterring any potential threats from rivals or pirates. They had to secure their interests.
So this strategic location right in the middle of all this trade.
Yeah, a cross range of commerce.
Must have made him a target.
Oh, for sure. Other powers were eyeing that territory.
Yeah. So Bokor Osman was smart to build up that navy.
Absolutely. A crucial investment in their security and their future.
So we've got this sultanate established.
Yeah, the foundations are laid.
They're in a prime location. They got a navy. And how did they actually govern this whole thing?
Okay, so their system of governance. Yeah, it was a really fascinating blend.
Of what?
Of those traditional Somali clan structures.
Okay, so they didn't just abandon the old ways.
No, they incorporated them, but they also brought in elements of centralized rule.
So bit of both.
Right. A hybrid system.
Interesting. So the Sultan was at the top.
Yeah, ultimate authority.
But he wasn't making decisions in a vacuum.
No, he had a council of elders and advisors.
So still drawing on that traditional wisdom.
Exactly. Tapping into that experience and knowledge.
So like a balance between central power and clan influence.
Precisely. A delicate balance.
And how did this play out on a more local level?
So they divided the sultanate into provinces.
Okay.
Each one had a governor appointed by the sultan, accountable to him.
So that's how they maintained control over a larger area.
Right, a way to manage things efficiently.
But I'm guessing they still gave some leeway to local leaders.
Yeah, they had some degree of autonomy.
Which probably helped keep them loyal.
Most likely, it was a way to ensure stability.
It's smart.
Yeah, a strategic approach to governance.
And speaking of stability, they had a military, right?
Oh, yeah. Both an army and a navy.
And these were crucial for maintaining order.
Absolutely, both internally and externally.
So for dealing with any internal rebellions and any external threats.
Exactly. They had to be prepared for both.
And your sources mentioned these forces were really well trained.
Oh, yeah. Very skilled warriors.
Drawn from the Majeerteen subclans.
Right, which is interesting.
Yeah. Why is that interesting?
Well, it's kind of fostered a sense of unity.
Like they were all fighting for a common cause.
Yeah, exactly.
And how did they recruit these soldiers?
So it wasn't just random. It was based on lineage.
So family ties mattered.
Yeah, but also on individual skill.
So you had to prove yourself.
Right, they weren't just taking anyone.
So they had high standards.
Oh, yeah. They invested in training.
What kind of training?
Well, for the army, combat techniques, horsemanship.
Essential skills for that time period.
Oh, yeah.
And for the Navy, maritime warfare.
Right. Navigation, ship handling, all that stuff.
So a well-rounded military.
Yeah, they took their defense seriously.
All right, so we've covered their political structure, their military. Now let's talk about their legal system.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay,
They actually had a dual legal system.
what does that mean?
They used both Islamic law, Sharia, and customary Somali laws. Hail.
Hey,
Yeah. So two different sets of laws working side by side.
wow. So how did they decide which one to apply?
Well, Sharia governed religious matters.
Things like marriage, inheritance,
Exactly.
and hair was more about social norms.
Right. Things like property rights and conflict resolution within the community.
So different laws for different situations.
Yeah, exactly.
And how is justice actually carried out?
Okay, so they had local courts
Okay,
overseen by religious scholars.
for the Sharia cases
Right.
in clan elders.
Yeah, for the hair cases.
Interesting. And from what I'm reading, they emphasized swift arbitration.
Yeah, they really valued quick resolutions.
Why was that?
Well, it helped to maintain social harmony.
So, avoiding prolonged disputes.
Right, nip those conflicts in the bud.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Whether it was a trade disagreement or a theft or a personal conflict, they
Wanted to find a fair solution fast.
exactly and move on.
So it sounds like this balance between central authority and participatory decision making, the key feature of their system.
Right. It seemed to work well for them.
Okay, so now that we've got a sense of how they ran things, let's talk money.
All right. The economics.
Yeah, their economy.
So the Majeerteen Sultanate, they were economically quite powerful.
Okay, what made them so successful?
Well, a big part of it was their location.
We talked about that, right, on the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. Prime real estate for trade. And they really took advantage of that. They built a strong economy driven by trade.
Trade was the engine.
Yeah, but also supported by agriculture and livestock.
Okay, so a diversified economy.
Yeah, they weren't just relying on one thing.
So let's start with trade. Who were they trading with?
Well, they had a pretty extensive network stretching across the Arabian Peninsula,
Wow.
Persia, India, and other parts of Africa.
So they were well connected.
Yeah, a major player in those trade routes.
And what were they exporting?
Okay, so their main exports were livestock.
Camels, cattle, all that.
Yeah. And what else?
Frankincense, myrrh hides.
These were all in high demand.
Oh, yeah, very valuable commodities.
And what were they bringing in?
Sure. So their imports included textiles, weapons, luxury goods.
So stuff for the elites and everyday people. Yeah, exactly. Catering to a range of needs and desires.
And this trade wasn't just happening randomly along the coast.
No.
Your sources mention specific commercial centers.
Right. They had key hubs, places like Bosaso, Hafun, Alula.
These were like the major trading ports.
Yeah. Bustling centers of activity.
And they were important not just for the exchange of goods, but also for cultural interactions.
Yeah, exactly. A mixing pot of different cultures.
And all this trade brought in wealth, tons of it, which allowed them to invest in other things.
Yeah, exactly. Their defenses, public works.
They could build up their infrastructure.
Exactly.
And this contributed to a more prosperous society.
Right. Everyone benefited.
So trade was really the foundation of their economic success.
Yeah, it was a driving force.
But you mentioned agriculture and livestock too.
Right. So while trade was crucial, they also had a strong agricultural base.
Where was this mostly happening?
In the more fertile inland areas.
Okay, so away from the coast. And what were they growing?
So they cultivated things like sorghum, maize, date palms.
Providing food for the population.
Exactly. Ensuring food security.
So they weren't just relying on imports for food.
No, they had their own production and livestock herding. That was huge.
Especially in the rural areas.
Yeah, it was a way of life.
And not just for food, right?
It was also a measure of wealth.
So the more livestock you had, the wealthier you were.
Exactly. And it was a source of social status.
So it played a big role in their society.
Huge.
And we can't forget about the Navy.
The Navy?
Yeah, its role in maritime trade.
Oh, yeah. That was crucial.
So they had these like strong commercial ties.
Yeah, with Yemen, Oman, the Swahili coast.
And they were exchanging Somali goods.
For spices, fabrics, all those valuable commodities.
Yeah, and the Navy protected those ships.
Right. Keeping those trade routes safe from pirates and other threats.
So they were really a force to be reckoned with.
Oh, yeah. A major player in the region.
Okay, so we've covered their economy.
It's there.
Now, let's talk about their foreign relations.
Right. Diplomacy.
Yeah, how they interacted with other powers.
So the Majeerteen Sultanate, they were quite active on the diplomatic front.
They had to be, right?
Yeah. With all those trade connections and powerful neighbors.
Exactly. So who were they dealing with?
Well, they had relationships with the Ottoman Empire.
Okay. A major power at the time.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Various Arab states.
Okay. And I'm guessing the Europeans were starting to make their presence known.
Oh, yeah. The British and the Italians especially.
So they had to navigate those colonial ambitions.
Right. That was a delicate balancing act.
So what kind of interactions were they having?
A lot of it involved trade agreements, securing favorable terms. Yeah, and also political understandings.
So trying to protect their interests.
Exactly. Maintaining their sovereignty.
And you mentioned those European colonial powers.
Yeah.
Things got pretty tricky in the late 19th century.
Oh, yeah. That's when the pressure really ramped up.
European powers were expanding their empires. Yeah. Grabbing land and resources.
So how did the Sultanate respond?
Well, their leaders at the time,
Boghar Osman and later Yusuf Ali Kennedy, they had to be pretty shrewd.
oh yeah, very strategic.
And they initially resisted direct colonization.
They did. They held their ground for a while.
And they even managed to secure some advantageous treaties.
Yeah, for a time. They played the game well.
But it couldn't last forever.
No, unfortunately not.
Eventually, they became a protectorate under Italian rule.
Right, in the early 20th century.
So their independence was effectively curtailed.
Yeah, they lost a significant degree of control.
But it wasn't an immediate takeover.
No, it was a gradual process.
Okay.
And even under Italian protection, they kind of retained some autonomy. So they weren't completely powerless. They still had some say in their affairs.
And their traditional leadership remained in place.
Yeah, that was important to them.
So a mix of accommodation and resistance.
Yeah, trying to make the best of a difficult situation. And you mentioned they also played a role in mediating conflicts.
Oh, yeah. They were quite active in that regard.
Okay, so not just dealing with the big powers, but also local disputes.
Right. Conflicts between Somali clans.
And even between Somali groups and foreign entities.
Exactly.
So they were peacemakers as well.
Yeah. Trying to keep things stable in the region.
Which probably helped protect their own interests too.
Absolutely. It was a strategic move.
Okay, so despite their strengths and their savvy diplomacy, the Majeerteen Sultanate eventually declined.
It did. It's a sad but common story.
What were the main factors that led to their downfall?
Well, it was a combination of things. Internal rivalries, economic fluctuations, and of course, those external pressures. The European influence.
So it was a perfect storm.
Yeah. Multiple factors converging.
And those internal rivalries.
Yeah.
You sent me some information about the conflict between Boghar Osman and Yusuf Ali Kennedy.
Right. That was a major issue.
So remind me who Yusuf Ali Kennedy was.
He was Boghar Osman's cousin.
Okay.
And he founded the Sultanate of Habyo.
So essentially a rival sultanate.
Yeah. Splitting the Majeerteen power base, which must have weakened them significantly.
And made them vulnerable to outside interference.
Exactly. They were playing right into the hands of the Europeans.
Yeah, a classic divide and conquer strategy.
Yeah, sadly.
And then the Italians came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Yeah.
And that really marked the beginning of the end.
It was a turning point.
Even though they had that protectorate status for a while.
Yeah.
Their power was diminishing.
Right.
And eventually they were absorbed into the Italian Somaliland colony.
Yeah. By the early 20th century, it was over.
So a gradual process, but a definitive one.
Yeah. Their era had come to an end.
But even though they're gone, they left a lasting impact.
They did. A significant legacy.
So what's your main legacy on Somali history?
Well, your sources point to a few key things.
Okay.
First, their system of governance.
That blend of central authority and clan structures.
Yeah. It set a precedent for future Somali states.
So it wasn't just a flash in the pan.
No, their ideas lived on.
And their economic achievements.
Yeah, their success with trade, agriculture, livestock.
That showed what was possible.
Right, a model for others to follow.
And we can't forget their naval prowess.
Oh, yeah, that was impressive.
They really dominated those waters for a time.
They were a formidable force.
So they left a mark in multiple areas.
Yeah, they made their presence felt.
And beyond the political and economic stuff, your sources mentioned their role in preserving Somali culture
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
during a time of huge external pressure.
Right. They held on to their traditions, their language, their identity. That's a really important part of their legacy.
So they weren't just a political entity, they represented something bigger.
Yeah, a cultural force.
And the influence of the ruling family didn't just vanish overnight.
No, it didn't.
Your sources say their descendants still play roles in Somali politics.
They do, which is fascinating.
Yeah, showing the enduring legacy of that lineage.
Right. Their impact is still felt today.
And people still celebrate Bokor Osman and other leaders.
Yeah, they're seen as national heroes.
So to wrap things up,
Okay.
the Majeerteen Sultanate, they were a major pre-colonial power in the Horn of Africa.
A force to be reckoned with.
They built a successful economy based on trade, agriculture, and livestock.
And they were smart about diplomacy.
Yeah, for a while they managed to navigate.
Those tricky waters, but they were ultimately brought down by internal divisions and colonial pressures.
Yeah, it's a familiar story, unfortunately.
But their contributions to Somali identity and governance are still felt today.
Absolutely, their legacy lives on.
So hopefully this deep dive has given everyone a better understanding of the Majeerteen Sultanate.
Yeah, a clear and concise overview.
Exactly.
That was our goal.
But before we finish, you've given me a lot to think about.
Good.
Especially their long history of dealing with all these different powers, regional and international. They were constantly adapting.
So it makes me wonder, how can we apply those experiences to understanding the challenges facing the Horn of Africa today?
That's a really interesting question.
Because they faced similar issues?
Yeah. Balancing internal stability with external pressures.
Exactly. So maybe there are some lessons to be learned.
Possibly some valuable insight.
I think that's something worth exploring further.
Yeah, definitely something to ponder.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap it up here.
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to everyone for listening.
Yeah, we appreciate your time.
We'll see you next time.
Take care.
Bye.